Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And thank you. Hopefully you will see the text in a second. I'll take care of that. So we are going to take a look. Go back to where we left off. Let's make sure I am in the right place. Yes. So we finished with the animals. That is the land, the large animals, cattle, sheep, goats. Essentially, we're told that we can only eat ungulates. And now we're going to the inhabitants of water creatures. Etzet tochelu, this you shall eat, mikol asher b'mayim, from all that is in the water. Kol asher lo snapir v'kaskeset. Okay, anything that has fins and scales, b'mayim, in the water, bayamim, in the seas, uvan chalim, and in the rivers, otam tochelu, those you shall eat. You notice that there's quite a bit of redundancy in this sentence, and so that is going to scream for interpretation. So let's take a look. So first of all, this word snapir, it doesn't occur too often. So referring to elu sheshat bahem. In other words, these are the things with which it swims, i.e., the fins of the fish. Kaskeset, elu klipim. These are peels or scales, hakavuim bo, that are attached to it, kamoshenemar, as it states, the shirion or sirion, I think it's shirion, and armor, kaskasim hu lavush. He was wearing armor of scales. So that's that idea, right? And of course, scales work in the same sense as the same way as scaled armor. V'chol asher ein lo snapir v'kaskeset, and anything that doesn't have fins and scales, bayamim uvan chalim, in the seas and in the rivers, in other words, both salt and fresh water, mikol sheretz hamayim, anything that, so Rashi translates sheretz as creeps. I think that sheretz can also mean to swarm, right? Umikol nefesh hachaya, and any living creature, asher b'mayim, which is in the water, sheketz heim lachem, they shall be detestable to you. You shall not eat them at all. You shall not want to ingest them at all. So sheretz, here is this word sheretz, as opposed to sheketz, right? The kama makomot, right? In many places, or in a number of places, mashma'o davar namuch, it represents, its connotation is something namuch, that is low down, sherochesh v'nad haaretz, that creeps and wanders over the earth. In other words, in types of insect life. Okay. We'll finish up this whole area here. V'sheketz yu lachem, right? They shall be something abominable to you, or detestable to you. Mibsaram lo tochelu, you shall not eat of their flesh. Ve'et nivlatam tishatetsu, and as to their carcasses, you shall abhor. So let's take a look here. All this redundancy, right? So v'sheketz yihiyu, and they shall be detestable to you. They will be. So I think it may the fact that it's talking in the plural, le'esor et eruvotehem. That is to forbid also mixtures containing any parts of these forbidden animals. In other words, the understanding of the redundancy is that the first time it's mentioned means they themselves. The second time it's mentioned means that it's to include any mixtures that contain parts of these animals that are forbidden. Im yesh bo menotentan, if there is in it something that gives it flavor. In other words, if the flavor of this mixture is influenced by this forbidden product, then it is biblically forbidden. So I need to clarify that I am sure that what Rashi is saying is an issue, a technical issue of whether it's biblically prescribed, biblically forbidden, or as opposed to rabbinically forbidden. And the practical distinction there has to do with the consequences as to, in terms of immortality, or whether you bring a sacrifice for violating it. Rabbinic prohibitions do not have sacrifices attached to them. Biblical prohibitions do have sacrifices attached to them, but they also have other kinds of issues as well. So I think that is the point that Rashi is making here, and that is derived, as you can see, from an interpretation of the biblical text. Mibsaram, of their flesh. Again, a careful reading of this. So biblically forbidden, eino muzhar al hasnapirim. So we are not forbidden from using the fins, the al ha'atzamot, or the bones. So again, just like we had with the land animals, all right, these are not biblically forbidden. They would be rabbinically forbidden in all likelihood. It's very simply because if the rabbis would argue that if we give permission to eat these particular parts of the animal, then inevitably we know the domino effect of these kinds of things. So it would be a rabbinic prohibition, a fence around the Torah, not to allow consumption of these other parts of the animal. Now, again, we know that there are limitations on that rabbinic prohibition depending on the circumstances. So, okay, going on. Nivlatam tishaketsu, and their bodies, their corpses, whatever, the carcasses, you shall hold in abomination, right? You should abhor them, okay? And this is, so again, this constant repetition in a way, l'rabot, so he says, this is to include yavchushin. A yavchush is, as you can see, a species of gnat or a certain type of red insect found in liquids, okay? The shesinanan, yavchushin shesinanan, that Yavchushin, if he has filtered out these particular insects, who knows? Maybe they were part of some kind of diet out there, okay? But these are to be included in this as well. And to find them, you have to actually filter the water to be left with these. And they are called moucheron, in Old French. And in Yiddish, it's kleine Fliegen, which means little fleas, water fleas, something like that in a foreign language. So again, there is a concern of, even though these things are very, very small, if they're what are called a bria, if they're in fact a living creature, even though they are much smaller than what is generally considered a biblically forbidden amount of forbidden food to be biblically forbidden. Generally speaking, it is the bulk of an olive, that amount of food that we're talking about. There are other amounts as well, depending again on the food, etc., and other various variables. But essentially, we can be talking about something very, very small. So, for example, an ant is certainly less than the size of an olive's bulk. Nevertheless, it's a complete creature and would be biblically forbidden. So, okay. Kol asher ein lo snapir v'kaskeset b'mayim, right? Anything that does not have a fins and scales in the water, sheketz hu lachem. It is a detestable thing to you. You need to stay away from it, right? So notice again, it could have said anything that doesn't have fins and scales, but the fact that it says it doesn't have fins and scales in the water means we need to look at it a little bit differently. So here we go.
Rabbi, I just want to add that in my last Rashi, there was a parenthetical part that said that you could ingest those little bugs if they were in the water, but once they're separated out, you can't.
Right, right. In other words, that you intentionally were eating them. In other words, thank you, Lauren. That's really very helpful. That's very helpful. Right. Okay. So in other words, the point that he adds about filtering them is that you're taking steps to intentionally eat these little insects. Right. Okay. But if you happen to ingest them when you're drinking water, no, it's not biblically forbidden. Okay. I remember there was this whole big deal with some drinking water in New York or New Jersey or something where they had discovered some tiny little insects or something, and they were forbidding the drinking of that water. So again, these are where we get to the sort of fuzzy parts of Jewish law and where people want to go to the ultimate extreme. Whether Rashi himself would have and those like him would have ruled in that particular way is another question. So of course we don't have carte blanche to violate rabbinic law. So exactly where Rashi is coming from on these, we have to realize that there's a certain amount of subtlety to it. Okay. Thank you, Lauren. Okay. So we said anything that doesn't have fins or scales in the water. And quoting now from the Sifra, this very early midrash on quite possibly a precursor of the Talmud. In fact, I think we can say that without hesitation, right? That many of the Talmudic discussions reflect earlier discussions in the Sifra and the Sifrei and other halachic midrashim. Okay. Ma Talmud lomar, right? What is Scripture teaching? Sheyachol ein lo. What does it mean that it doesn't have fins and scales? Sheyeh mutar, okay, that it might be. In other words, why would we think? I believe I'll try and see if I can translate this well. Okay, so Ma Talmud lomar sheyachol אין לי שיהא מותר אלא המעלה סימנים שלו ליבשה. Okay. So, in other words, it's okay. Here we go. Ma Talmud lomar? Question mark. What is Scripture teaching us? Shiachol, right? Because it's possible that we would interpret the sentence Ein li sheyehei mutar, that it is not permissible ela hama'aleh simanim shelo layabasha. Okay, but we are talking about a situation where where it takes these simanim, that is the fins and scales, onto the dry land. In other words, when you remove it from the water, it retains the fins and scales. Heshiran, okay, and if it casts off the fins and scales when it's taken onto dry land, b'mayim minayin. Okay, so I feel like I'm reading this wrong, and when I prepared it, I understood. Okay, in the waters, how do we know this? Talmud Lomar, scripture teaches us, Kol asher ein lo snapir v'kashkeshet pamayim. So the point that Rashi is making, although I'd like to do a better job of translating this for you now, okay, is he says the reason why it says that which doesn't have fins and scales in the water, ha'im hayulo b'mayim, okay, so even if it had fins and scales in the water, afal pi sheheshiran ba'aliyato, even though those fins and scales drop off when you take it up onto the dry land, mutar, it is still permissible. So let me go back and take a look at this more carefully and see if I can do a better job. Okay. Right. So what we're saying is this. Ma Talmud Lomar. What is Scripture teaching us? Sheachol, because it's possible, Eli Sheye Mutar. It's possible that this is only permissible. You're only allowed to eat these animals that have fins and scales, right? When they're Ela Hamale Simanin Shalo Liyavasha, right? Okay, Mutar. That only when they're in the water they're permissible. But let me see. Okay, they're only permissible if they retain those fins and scales when they go up onto the dry land. Heshiran, what happens if they come off when you take it out of the water? Okay. Uh, sorry, it seems to be saying just the opposite. In other words, it's saying that they're only permissible if you might think that only if they retain their fins and scales, no matter what. That's what it's saying, right? That they're only allowed if they have the fins and scales when you take it out of the water. Heshiran, but if those fins and scales are removed or get cast off, right? Wow. Sorry, I am not doing a good job here for some reason. Sorry. Yeah, right. Okay, sorry. Heshiran bamayim. What if they came off in the water? Minayin. How do we know that they're still permitted? Okay. Right. Okay. Talmud Lomar. Scripture teaches Kol asher ein lo snapir b'keshkeshet pamayim. So it's saying if it doesn't have fins and scales in the water, ha'im hayu lo b'mayim. So it says if it doesn't have fins and scales while it's in the water, ha'im hayu lo b'mayim. So as long as this animal has fins and scales in the water, afal pi sheheshiran ba'aliyato, despite the fact that those fins and scales drop off when it comes out of the water, mutar, it is still permissible. So I don't know if I need to go over it one more time just to make sure this is clear. Are you comfortable for me moving on, or do you want me to clarify it one more time?
I'm just trying to equate it to something in our real world today. That's got to be a frog or a tadpole.
Well, they're not
Doesn't
permissible.
have fins.
It
Or
doesn't.
it has fins, but it has no scales.
Right, but it's not permissible. Frogs are not permissible, okay, and because they don't have, they don't have, they have scales, but they don't have fins, right? I think
No, they have
They have
fins,
fins,
but
but
they
no.
don't have scales,
Exactly.
tadpoles.
I thought reptiles have scales.
We're talking about amphibians, first of all, and their tadpoles
Tadpoles.
have fins but not scales.
Yeah.
But swordfish
Yes.
have um
Right. They
scales when they're juvenile,
correct.
and when they get up to a certain length and certain age, their scales drop. And if you take them out of the water, and I don't think this is what it was talking about, because it could be talking about that just the skins are just, falling off, like maybe they're being scraped against the dock or whatever, as you bring it up and they're falling off. But the swordfish, if you bring it up at a certain age, it's going to be scaleless.
Right.
And if you bring it up at a different age, it will have scales.
Right. Right. So that, of course, is a halachic question. There are those authorities who allow swordfish and those authorities who don't. And there are other issues too which is whether the scales that the swordfish has are actually scales, or whether there's something else. There's a lot of discussion. This is food for halachic dispute, the swordfish question. So, but yeah, so
But I mean, I can't imagine that a fish with scales and fins would necessarily drop them when they're being caught
right.
unless something's cutting them or scraping them. They wouldn't just necessarily fall off. I mean, if a shark bit them, wouldn't they be kind of treifa anyway?
That's a good question. I don't know that fish come under the category of treif. I don't believe they do. I don't know. Okay, I just, clearly they don't mention treifa here. As I said, taruf means torn, but I don't know that applies to fish. We know, for example, that the separation of milk and meat do not apply to fish, that fish can be considered dairy as well. Okay, right. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I'm sorry I had so much trouble rereading this. It's crazy because now I'm looking at it and it looks pretty straightforward. Okay, right? Yeah, right. That it's basically saying maybe the Torah is saying that it just as long as it has fins and scales in the water, right? But let me see how it's reading. Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, the issue of whether it loses those fins and scales when it comes out of the water. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. So I don't know what fish they're talking about other than swordfish, right? And we know that the swordfish lose them even before they come out of the water. So it needs clarification. All right. Let's see where we are. This is probably actually a good place for us to stop because we are going to go on to birds next time. So we'll put that there. Interestingly, if I may mention, is that it appears that the interpretation that the Sifra has on this is actually a little bit of a leniency as opposed to making it stricter. So let me stop the share. And there we are. Okay. So
So
yeah, go ahead.
you were talking about the amount of a bone or other body part that had to be olive size and not affect the taste. So bringing back to marshmallows,
Yes.
because the amount of a hoof in if you consolidated just the gelatin in a kosher marshmallow would probably be smaller, and it's not meant for taste, it's meant for texture. And I
Right.
know that they make kosher um, marshmallows with fish bones and vegan with tapioca, but um, I think that there's still like I was also thinking about like in the water. Now there might be an Orthodox person that would die of thirst rather than drink water that they are sure or pretty sure has those bugs in it, or die of hunger rather than eat a lettuce even if they can't see the little bugs. But, which brings up the whole question is saving a life, does that trump every um halachic order if it gets in the way of life? But there's also the other part of martyrdom, which is like you don't give up any halacha even to save your life. Or maybe it's just you don't become an idol, to save your life. But it's very complicated. But I mean, I've been weighing these issues because I've been eating kosher marshmallows and not eating swordfish. And it sounds to me from my reading that it might be okay for me to eat the marshmallows, but not the swordfish. because it says that most that swordfish grow. First of all, swordfish grow rapidly, so they drop their scales fairly early. And then I looked at a picture of the swordfish scales, and you're right, they don't look like other scales. They're kind of look more almost tooth-like,
Yes,
kind of jagged and pointy.
right.
They're still called scales by science, but since they look differentiated, they may not be called scales by, religion or whatever. And
So let me,
so I don't see why not eat a non-kosher marshmallow though.
okay. So I'm trying to think of, there was a rabbi, I don't know if his name was David Scheinkopf, who wrote a major monograph over the kashrut of things that other people are considering non-kosher. The issue, okay, so you started off with the olives bulk thing, okay? That has to do, again, that's not an admixture necessarily, okay? And there are different sizes. There's a size of a pomegranate, there's a size of a bean, etc. Okay, so that has to do with generally other sorts of things. The the uh, the issue of marshmallows has more to do with the fact that in extracting the gelatin from the bones or the hoof of the animal, the process basically makes it at some point inedible, and it's no longer, I mean, it just bears no relationship to the original product. Whether an Orthodox Jew would rather be a martyr than consume, gelatin or a lettuce leaf that might have bugs on it or drink water, there's no question that from an Orthodox Jewish point of view, that is not the case. That they should go, if they're at a point of death and they need to eat that lettuce, or if they're at the point of death and they or even severe illness, okay, they should go ahead and eat it. There are essentially three areas where one is supposed to choose death over violating this particular law. And the three examples are idolatry. In other words, if someone says to you, you need to worship that idol, if you don't worship that idol, I will kill you, you're supposed to accept death.
But pretending to worship isn't worshiping.
Again, that you're peeling the onion. Okay.
Okay, well, let's move on to the other two.
Please understand, I'm
Yeah.
only trying to give a broad picture here to suggest that this is the be all and end all of the subject. I'm not trying to suggest that at all. I'm just trying to put this in terms of being able to categorize it. Okay. The second situation is immorality. Okay. If somebody
Sexual immorality
correct. If somebody says
as defined biblically.
in the Torah, right, correct. So if somebody says, I want you to engage with this married woman, otherwise I will kill you, you are supposed to accept it, right? Or commit incest or anything like that. Okay, that's the second case. And the third case is if they want you to murder someone else. If they say, I will kill you unless you kill this other person, you're not supposed to put your life ahead of that other person. Now, there are all kinds of other issues that arise. And I will tell you, there is an exception to all of this. And that is given in the Talmud that I remember reading, which is, so for example, and this goes to the other extreme, which is if a government makes a broad edict, okay, that says that if Jews wear a talit, for example, they're to be put to death, right? Or unless Jews wear, I think it goes to this extent, that unless Jews mix wool and linen, they are going to be put to death. You're supposed to accept martyrdom. Now, this is a broad edict that includes all Jews. Okay. In that is considered to be sort of a different kind of situation, etc. And that's where those three particular issues don't apply in the same way. So again, I've just taken this a step further. Most people are aware of the first issue that I mentioned, of the three particular specific things where one is supposed to accept martyrdom. but it gets way more complicated than that. But it's good to know the basic foundational principle. And the principle is that these laws, the statement is, you shall live by them, you shall not die by them. And that's the basic justification for violating laws in these kinds of situations where death would be the alternative. The laws are
So,
there.
so regular marshmallows are okay.
Well, I didn't say that, did I? They may be.
You didn't say they weren't.
No, I didn't, because as I said, I believe the author of this halachic investigation is, I think his name is Scheinkopf. I think it is. And he knows what he's talking about. He's not an ignoramus, and he tries to take into account all the issues. I will tell you that it seems to me, and this isn't you, Lauren, at all, but there are people who seek leniencies, and you have to ask yourself, why are they seeking these leniencies, right? Because eventually they just don't want to do it at all. So they're sort of in a middle ground in which, they're moving in that, if they're constantly looking for leniencies. On the other hand, you want to have a balance, right? I think, always going overly strict is not a merit either, necessarily. So, but basic principle, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And you have to make choices, So for me, family is a great issue, as you know. So, okay, we'll stop the recording here.